Hey guys, what's up? How about a funny video about my old buddy Snakeman? Something interesting I was thinking about. Yesterday I was riding my Cannondale Super 6 Evo. I absolutely love that bike. It's got, right now I've got Gravel King 32s on it, the smooth kind, and they ride to me like about as fast as any road tire I've ever used. I feel like they're really fast, and 32s, they're not too heavy, they climb good, and at 50 pounds of pressure, they're way more comfortable than any road tire I've ever used. And I was riding this bike and I was thinking, this is the absolute best combination of speed and comfort that I've ever ridden in a bike. I was like, this thing can handle gravel roads, it can handle highways, it climbs good. I'm like, this is perfect. And I started thinking about it, I was like, it's such a shame that Snakeman didn't have this bike. So let me tell you about Snakeman. He's probably like 40 years older than me or something. I don't know how. He's an old guy now. He always looked old because he had a giant beard. And so Snakeman, he got into riding in the very early 90s. And I met him in town. He didn't live too far from me, and I started riding bikes with him when I was 14, 15 years old. And so I really enjoyed riding with him because, you know, when you're 14 or 15-year-old, you're not going to go out and do big, long rides by yourself. You needed somebody to kind of guide you. And so this was the guy who got me into cycling. And so Snakeman had a specialized allay. Yeah, they used to make allays back then. It was steel, and it was a sport touring bike. Sport touring meant that it was basically a triple, but it didn't have like cantilever brakes. It had regular brakes, but it was a triple. So it wasn't really a touring bike, but it was a sport touring bike. And honestly, they were a really good idea because at the time, drivetrains didn't have that much range of gear. Cassettes everything was too highly geared. So if you got that triple, which was like 32, 42, 52, and that 32, and usually like my bike at the time was a triple, and it was a 32-25, and that was low enough to climb pretty well. You know, you could use that triple and climb a lot of big hills, even if you weren't a very fit guy, you know, like me, or kid. But anyway, so Snakeman, he got into riding long distance, and for him, cycling was all about pace and distance. He hated the idea of like hurting himself, and he read a lot of books and magazines and stuff, and he just got it into his head that cycling, it was all about like pacing, almost like a marathon or something, you know, where like he never wanted to push too hard because he thought, well, that's going to hurt me and I won't be able to finish the ride and it's going to slow me down in the long run. So like on hills, he wanted to always spin. He called himself the spin master sometime, which I always thought was funny. But Snake, you know, he believed in things like you've never seen. Like he just almost, you know, things would become religious to him. He's a very religious person, and cycling, you know, he had like a lot of faith in the things that he believed in cycling. So he started doing longer rides. He did like a 150-mile ride on this LA, and he come to the conclusion that he wanted something faster, and he said, his exact words to me is like, I don't want anything to hold me back. I want to be able to be the best that I can be, so I want the machine that can allow me the best that I can be. So he started researching bikes, and he did all kinds of research, and we went to bike shops, me and him and my brother and other people around. We drive all over the country. We went to all kinds of bike shops looking at bikes and talking about bikes. And he finally decided it was either a Klein aluminum or a Trek 5500 carbon. He got that. There was a purple Trek that he really, really, really liked, and he ended up going with the Trek. Even though he loved the paint jobs on the Kleins, he decided that the carbon, being like the hot new material on the market, the Trek OCLV was the most efficient carbon bike and very strong and everything. And he was sold on it, so he got a Trek, and I think this was 94. So this bike had Dura-Ace 7400. It was $3,000. He bought it from Carbondale Cycle. And I remember people just thought he was crazy, you know, because like a good bike at the time was maybe $500 or $600, you know, like a pretty decent, like his Specialized was like a $600 bike, and I thought that was a great, you know, bike. Race bikes were maybe couple $1,000s for like a high-end race bike, but he had spent $3,000 on this, you know, Trek 5500. Now, when he got this thing, it was all new, you know, like technology that wasn't really around yet. For example, he had a threadless headset. So the rest of us could all just raise and lower our stems with one bolt, but he had to go get these rings, and he was showing me, he's like, I've got 2 spacers, and I can put 2 more in, and that's as high as I can take it. And I'm like, well, I don't see how that's better. That's really, you got like almost no adjustments. We didn't know you could go get different stems and stuff, and he didn't want to swap out to a different stem from what came on his awesome new bike. So he also had 23. So most of the, like, we were riding like 25s. This bike was a race bike, and it come with 23s. So smaller, faster tire. It also came with the Dura-Ace drivetrain, which was kind of like their middle. So they had a 26 tooth cassette, 2611, 2311, and 2111. The 2111 was the hardcore race cassette. The 26 was like the mountain climbing cassette, and the 23 was like kind of the general purpose cassette. So his biggest cog on the back was a 23, and of course the crank was, as all cranks were that weren't triples, were pretty much back then, most of them, was a 5339. So it was the race crank too, with the big 53 and the 39, and so his gears were way too high for him. So the first few times he started climbing, he's like, I can barely like push myself over these hills. This thing is so like over geared. He took it back to the bike shop. He swapped out to the 26 tooth mountain cassette, and they were like, yeah, this is what the guys, when they're climbing Alps and stuff and the Tour de France, they're going to use this cassette. And he still said, it's way too, it's too hard. I can't get into my rhythm, my spin when I go up climbs. So over there at Carbondale Cycle, they put a different cage on his Dura-Ace derailleur. They made like an alternative cage that made it long enough to have a 28. And he had a 28 tooth cassette for a while, which was really low compared to what most of us were riding. But still, since he didn't have the triple, he was geared high, and he didn't like it, but he used it. He used that for several years. Now eventually he swapped out to the 9-speed, like he got Ultegra shifters, and he got a Dura-Ace, because 9-speed was very compatible. He got a Dura-Ace, he got an XT rear derailleur and a mountain bike cassette, and then he was really happy because he could just spin like crazy. He's like, these gears are wonderful. And so Snakeman, he kind of got like burned out on riding in the maybe mid 2000, like around 2005 or so. I think he really burned himself out. He started doing 200-mile rides, and I remember also he said he was having some issues with like just discomfort. The bike was harsh. The roads were like causing, he said his hands hurt, and his back hurt, and it was just, he said it was just uncomfortable. He was on 23 tires, and he was probably running 100 pounds of pressure, if not more. And so, yeah, he kind of limited himself at this time to just riding like a handful of different super smooth routes that were like paved shoulders, really nice paved shoulders on highways that he would ride. And that was it. So when he quit riding, and I kind of started getting a little bit more back into it. And I remember in around 2008, 2009, I was doing a lot of more like kind of back roads riding, like a lot more like oil and chips and kind of different stuff than Snake had ever done with people. And so in 2009, he gives me a phone call and he says, hey, I'm getting back into riding. I'm doing it again. I've got my bike all cleaned up. I put new tires on it, and I want to go for a ride. And I said, okay, well, I've been doing this awesome new route. You want to check it out? And he said, yeah. So I took him on this route, and kind of near the end, he said, this is the worst route I've ever done in my life. And he really struggled. He struggled to stay with me. And I wasn't in good shape back then. But it really bothered him that, he was really struggling to stay with me. And I'm like, man, you haven't rode a bike in years. And he's like, I remember he said, I'll never be like I was. I'll never be like I was. And I said, he'd been riding, like this wasn't his first ride. He'd been kind of doing like training rides. Like he did like he had a standard like 20-mile super flat, super smooth route that he did. He'd been doing it by himself at his like super spin pace. And I remember he said this route was too uncomfortable. It hurt too much. His brakes, he didn't like riding the hilly stuff, the little short rolling and stuff, because he said, my hands hurt from using the brakes. And so he was unhappy about that. So he never really rode again. I didn't ride with him. I think he more or less quit again shortly after that ride. And I thought, wow, I'm responsible for him quitting from one ride. I felt really bad about it. But anyway, I was thinking about him, and I was thinking, like, bike technology has finally got to where it needs to be. Like, this is the bike. Snakeman would have been so happy on this Cannondale with these tires. You know, like, we had this mentality in our heads back then. I remember arguing with people so much about 28s, because I had a lot of people that were like, you need to get 28s. And this was usually on the internet, because I was on the internet at this time, you know, a lot, and forums and stuff. And people were like, 28s are faster and more comfortable, and you can run lower pressure. And I'm like, that's stupid. You know, why would you run heavier, bigger, slower tires? You know, 23s all day, every day. And so, you know, like, I would have arguments over and over and over again with people about this. And you know, we never knew, like, I mean, they knew, obviously, you know, but he could have kept riding. He could have put bigger tires on that LA. He had the gearing he liked, and bigger tires, he might have got a more comfortable ride. He didn't need a racing bike. He had just been studying magazines and reading about bikes, and he got into the hype. And I was thinking, now, you know, like, that kind of same thing happens, but now at least any race bike is going to be more comfortable and more suitable for just about anything. If you get a gravel race bike, you could probably use it as a touring bike and do just about anything with it. So bike technology has really, really come a long way, and it's a shame it took as long as it did for it to get, you know, usable in a way where we weren't buying these like silly race bikes. I think he would have been so much happier if he just kept that LA and just rode it, you know, and maybe even got bigger tires and anything. But yeah, that's just an interesting story. See ya.